Okay, so we are going to talk about bones and skeletal tissue. And we're going to start this off by talking about some roles of the skeletal system. So, what does the skeletal system do for us? Well, one of the more obvious roles is going to be providing attachment sites for muscles. So, muscles are able to generate tension and they can pull on those hard bones of the skeletal system and create movement. Skeletal system is also active for protecting and supporting internal structures. So kind of picture your brain and the fact that you've got your skull around it, kind of like a helmet. It helps protect your brain from all the crazy things that you're going to do to it. Location of blood producing cells, and the fancy word for this is hematopoiesis. And so this is space that is located within the bones that contain cells that are responsible for production of all of the blood cells in the body, like red blood cells and white blood cells. It serves as a storage site for inorganic salts. It also contains these little passageways for blood vessels and nerves to travel through. And then we have a second type of bone marrow. This is going to be yellow marrow. This is red marrow up here. So this is red marrow creates space for hematopoiesis to happen. Yellow marrow is a little bit different, and it serves as a storage site for fat. And this basically is going to be an energy source that our body is able to use and burn off as needed. Okay, so skeletal system. When we talk about skeletal system, we are including bones, we include cartilages that cover the ends of bones, joints that are formed by bones coming together, tendons that are attaching muscle to bone, and then ligaments that are attaching bone to bone. And it's important to remember that bones are, in fact, organs. They are made up of different tissue types. So we've got connective tissue, we've got epithelial tissue with lining of blood vessels that are contained within bone. We've got nerves, so we've got nerve tissue, and several types of connective tissue even, because we've got tendons and ligaments that are included as well. So we can take the skeletal system as a whole and we can divide it up into two different parts. One's going to be the axial skeleton, and the second part is going to be the appendicular skeleton. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. In terms of skeletal cartilage, we do have some different types of cartilage that are present in the skeletal system. And these different types are there because they're going to have different functions based on the type of cartilage that it is. And if you recall from our tissue information, cartilage is avascular, which, if you remember what that means, it means that it has no blood, so no blood supply dedicated to it. And then it has no nerves, so it's not innervated. So no blood and no nerves present in cartilage. But what is interesting about cartilage is that it's mostly water. And so this makes it really resilient. It's able to handle compression well, which is really good because a lot of times when we look at the ends of bones, we have cartilage that is lining the ends of the bones, and it's basically going to cover the part of the bone that's going to come into contact with the other part of the bone, the other bone that's creating that joint, and it's able to absorb cartilage, or absorb compression, and is very resilient, doesn't break down very easily. So if you look at cartilage, it's surrounded by this dense, irregular connective tissue, and we call this perichondrium. So peri means around, and whenever you see the word chond, it means cartilage. So chond is going to mean cartilage. And so this perichondrium is basically this dense, irregular connective tissue that surrounds cartilage. So if we had, let's say, an intervertebral disc here, which we know is created or is contains cartilage, we're going to have this perichondrium around the outside of it that is this kind of layer of dense irregular connective tissue. And what do we know about that? How stretchy is that dense irregular connective tissue going to be? Well, it's not very stretchy at all. So what ends up happening is as we compress those intervertebral discs and we have force exerted on them, that perichondrium along the outside is going to help to hold that disc material inside it. So it resists expansion when the cartilage is compressed. So that perichondrium is really dense and thick. It's made out of the same type of tissue as the capsules, like in the shoulder. And so as you compress the cartilage, that perichondrium is not going to let it, push out too far. Also, what's important about the perichondrium is that it contains blood vessels because the cartilage itself has no blood vessels, so it's got to get its blood supply from somewhere. So that perichondrium helps to supply some nutrients to the cartilage. And also, too, I'm asking you here, we talked about cell types, resident cell types in connective tissue when we talked about tissue. So what type of cell is in cartilage? So what we see in cartilage are going to be chondrocytes, or if they are immature cartilage cells, they're going to be chondroblasts, and that means that they are actively secreting their specific matrix. So there are 3 different types of cartilage, and again, you probably recall some of this from tissues because this should be review. We did talk about this in the tissues lecture, but realizing too that all cartilages are going to contain chondrocytes, or they're going to contain their cell type, their resident cell type, which in this case is going to be chondrocytes, and then they're also going to contain extracellular matrix, which consists of ground substance, and in this case it's going to be kind of like a gel, a jelly-like ground substance, and the specific fiber type. Okay, or sorry, hold on, let's get rid of that. And let's get rid of that. It's just ground substance. And then fiber types, which is, which are going to be collagen or elastin, and different types of cartilage are going to have different concentrations of each. So here's our 3 types of cartilage. We've got hyaline cartilage, we've got elastic cartilage, and we've got fibrocartilage. Okay. So here's an overview. Let's talk about each one. Hyaline cartilage is going to be the most common type. The fiber type that it contains is going to be collagen fibers. So this is going to be high resistance to tensile forces. And we have types of hyaline cartilage. We're going to see hyaline cartilage that we also refer to as articular cartilage, and that is cartilage that's located at the ends of bones where the joints are formed. So where your elbow forms, or maybe where your wrist or your fingers. So ends of bones. Costal cartilage, anytime you see the word costal, it means ribs. So you're going to see costal cartilages where the ribs attach to the sternum. Respiratory cartilages, you see lining your respiratory tract, and what they do there is open your airway to maintain a patent airway so that we can let air flow in and out. And then nasal cartilage, so this is going to be in your nose. So all of those are different locations of hyaline cartilage. Also of note too, the embryonic skeleton is formed initially entirely of hyaline cartilage, when the fetus is very new, and then gradually that hyaline cartilage is replaced by bone. So that hyaline cartilage forms like a template for the bone to come in and lay down before the baby's born. Elastic cartilage is our second type of cartilage. As the name implies, this is going to include a higher concentration of elastic fibers, so it allows it to be a little bit bendy. You see elastic cartilage in two locations in the body. One is going to be the external ear, and then the second one is the epiglottis, which is the tiny little flap of elastic cartilage that prevents food from traveling down into your lungs and routes it down your esophagus like it's supposed to. Fibrocartilage is our third type of cartilage. Fibrocartilage is really important. It's able to resist compressive and tensile forces, and so it's located in areas that are that tend to undergo both pressure and stretch. So as a result, it contains really thick collagen fibers, so that's able to resist those forces. Locations of fibrocartilage include your intervertebral discs, so the tiny discs that are in between your vertebrae stacked up on your spine, your pubic symphysis, which is the joint created anteriorly as the two halves of your pelvis come together, and then menisci in your knee, which basically form these little, we call them cushions, that help to absorb shock and improve the fit of your knee joints. So cartilage does grow, especially when you're younger. So I'm telling you here, cartilage does grow to a point. Typically what we see is when your skeletal growth ends, so when your bones stop growing, your cartilage tends to stop growing too. And then another change that we see as well is that as you age, that your cartilage tends to be a little bit harder because mineral salts end up being deposited in that cartilage. So if you're 16 and you're playing basketball and you injure your cartilage playing basketball, you have a pretty good chance of that cartilage healing and regrowing. If you are 50 and you injure your cartilage playing basketball, it's much less likely that that cartilage is going to grow and regenerate. It's just not happening. And so then you're probably looking at a scope of your knee to kind of get rid of that torn cartilage. When cartilage grows, it grows in two different ways. So one of them is going to be what we call appositional growth. And that is basically, if you look at the edge of the cartilage, and we know that we've got that dense, irregular connective tissue layer, that perichondrium that covers the outside of the cartilage. Basically, chondrocytes just inside or just at the meeting of the cartilage and the perichondrium, chondrocytes within that perichondrium differentiate into active chondroblasts that actively secrete the cartilage matrix. And so this grows cartilage more on the external surface of the cartilage. The second type of growth is going to be interstitial growth. And what we see there is that cartilage that's kind of housed within the main part of the cartilage. We have these little chondrocytes that are housed in these little circles. These are called lacuna, and they're going to secrete cartilage matrix from more of an internal position, kind of deeper within the cartilage. So two different ways that cartilage grows, more from the inside, and then appositional growth would be more along the edge of the cartilage just under that perichondrium. Okay, we can take bones in the body, and there are 206 total bones in the human skeleton, and we can divide them up into their location, which is either going to be axial or appendicular. And we can also take those bones and divide them based on their shape. So let's talk through some of this. This is classification of bones by location. So if we look at where they're located, axial skeleton is going to be the skull, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. And so that's basically indicated here in blue. That's called the axial skeleton. And the axial skeleton provides a lot of structure for us. Structure and stability. Okay, so the function is to protect, to support, and to carry other body parts. So all of this through here is basically here to provide a stable base for our appendicular skeleton to connect to. So our appendicular skeleton, or appendages, and appendages basically means our arms and our legs. So these are going to be appendages. So we've got arms, and then we've got legs, and those are going to be part of our appendicular skeleton. These also include the shoulder and the pelvic girdles, so clavicle or collarbone, and your scapula or your shoulder blade are also included in this as well. So what we see with the appendicular skeleton is we have a lot more mobility, because our arms and our legs are there to move us around our environment, right? They help us move, they help us manipulate our environment. That's how you can pick up your coffee cup in the morning, or fix your hair, or get to class, okay? So we've got mobility over on this side with our appendicular skeleton. We've got stability over on this side with our axial skeleton. Classifications of bones by shape. So bones come in some different shapes, and these are very good examples of complementarity, because the functions of that bone in that particular area is going to be dependent on how it's shaped. So we see long bones, and long bones are basically going to be longer than they are wide. So pretty much all of the bones of your extremities are going to be long bones. So this includes the bones in your fingers. Those are long bones too, because it's not based on how long they are. It's based for the shape. So even those little bones in your fingers are long bones, just like your really big, long femur or thigh bone would be. Short bones. So short bones are basically like little kind of short cubes or squares. These are going to include the bones of your wrist, and we call those carpal bones, or the bones of your ankle, and we call those the tarsals. This is showing you the tarsals of your ankle here. And we do have a specific type of short bone called a sesamoid bone. And this is a bone that is embedded within a tendon. So I'm trying really hard. It's not working so well. I was trying to draw your patellar tendon here, kind of one that everybody's used to or familiar with. So this could be your patella or your kneecap. Here's your quads heading down to a patellar tendon, and then your kneecap is basically embedded within that tendon. And so your kneecap or your patella is a specific type of short bone called a sesamoid bone. And you've got a few of these in your body, but the patella is probably one of the more identifiable ones. Then we have flat bones, and flat bones are basically what you would think. They are kind of thin flat. So these are going to include your scapula or your shoulder blade. The bones of your skull are flat, and then your sternum would be a flat bone. And then irregular bones. And so these guys are bones that basically, as you would imagine, don't really fit into any other category. So this is going to be your vertebrae, because they've got all these like crazy bony processes that stick out. Those would definitely be irregular. This crazy looking bone right here is your coxal bone. which is your half of your pelvis. And so again, we've got all these crazy bony prominences that stick out because of muscles attaching to them. Okay, and if we look at gross anatomy of bone, we're going to start with gross anatomy first, and then we'll go in and look at microscopic anatomy. But we talked about this before. Bones are organs because they do contain different tissue types. And what we tend to see with bones is that bones have an external layer of what we call compact bone, okay, on the outside, and then an internal layer of spongy bone. So it's basically a little more open on the inside. You can see that here, and the compact bone is going to be a little bit more dense. So what we see with, in particular with short, irregular, and flat bones, they all create this scenario where they have spongy bone in the center, and they've got compact bone around the edges. And we call this diplo. That's that specific kind of arrangement here. I always refer to this as a spongy bone sandwich because you've got compact bone, and then kind of like a more airy spongy bone on the inside. So there's your spongy bone sandwich. Now, long bones are a little bit different. If you'll notice, that was the one that we left out of this list. So long bones are a little bit different. They've got some different factors here. So they're a little interesting, and we talk about them in a little bit more detail. So if we look at anatomy of long bones, we see the shaft of the long bone, or the main part of the long bone. If I just draw kind of a generic long bone here, the main part of the long bone is going to be the diaphysis. And so that's going to be this part through here. Okay, so what's important with the diaphysis is going to be, it's got a medullary cavity, so it's basically got this space on the inside of it that is filled with yellow marrow, and this serves as the area of fat storage for our body, one area that we store fat. So that's going to be filled with yellow bone marrow. We also have in the diaphysis a blood vessel that's going to come and insert into the diaphysis there. And we call that the nutrient artery. And one of the things we talked about with tissues is that bone is highly vascular. And this is one of the ways that we get all of that blood supply to our bones is through this nutrient artery. So this artery is going to insert into the diaphysis of the bone, and then it's going to divide, and it's going to travel, all through the compact bone and the spongy bone, and give that bone a really good blood supply, which is great because then when you break it, and it does bleed, but it also heals back. So bone is really regenerative. We're able to heal once we break our bones, which is a good thing. And then the next thing is the two ends of the bone are called the epiphyses. And so this is going to be, let's see, we'll do this in maybe magenta. No, we've already done magenta. Let's do a different color. We'll do gray. So epiphyses. So this end here is going to be an epiphyse, okay? And let's say that this is our proximal epiphyse, so we can actually get a little more detailed. So like this would be the top part closer to like where it attaches to our body. And then this would be our distal epiphyse here, okay? So that's going to be kind of the end of the bone, right? And so what's important here is that the epiphyses of the bone are covered in a thin layer of hyaline cartilage. And that's going to basically cover like the ends of the bone where they're going to form a joint, which is why we call this articular cartilage, to be more specific. And then we're going to have a line that is located between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, and that's going to be our epiphyseal line. And so what you see is that this used to be a growth plate. That used to be an area of hyaline cartilage that was replaced by bone as the person was growing. It would basically make that bone get longer. And then when the cartilage stops dividing and growing and it just becomes bone, we're left with just a line of cartilage there, and that's called the epiphyseal line. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. This metaphysis is going to be this area here. So metaphysis and metaphysis there, and it basically is where the bone kind of flares out as we're going from the diaphysis into the epiphyses on each end. So that's going to be the metaphysis. It's going to be in between. Okay, there's some membranes that are relevant to long bones too. The first one's going to be the periosteum. And so what we see with periosteum is it basically covers the entire external surface of the bone except for the ends where the articular cartilage is. So it's not going to be here because we've got articular cartilage there. But what we're going to see is, let's see, we'll do some periosteum in magenta. So periosteum is going to be this dense, irregular connective tissue that is covering kind of that external surface, okay? And this sounds familiar. This is related to bone, but we had kind of a similar setup when we were talking about cartilage, right? We had that perichondrium, and this is basically the same setup. So what's kind of interesting about this is that this periosteum is going to be two layers. So the outer layer is going to be a dense, irregular connective tissue, and then the inner layer is going to be right up here, right up against the bone, and this is going to be osteogenic cells, okay? And what we mean by that is that these guys can differentiate into osteoblasts when they are needed to allow the bone to grow in width, okay? So it's going to basically deposit bone right here, right along the edge of the bone, and it's going to make the bone get thicker or wider. And this is how our bones respond to stress. When you stress your bone, it is stimulated to lay down more bone, and this is how it happens in terms of bones getting thicker. Okay, periosteum is highly innervated and vascularized. Okay, highly innervated. You probably know this because if you've ever gotten kicked in the shin, or if you've ever had shin splints, that is all thanks to your periosteum and the fact that it's highly innervated. So it's very painful. Periosteum is what tendons and ligaments are going to attach to. And so sometimes when you put stress on them, they are going to pull that periosteum away from the bone, and it really hurts in that area. And so that could be a cause of your shin splints, or if you get kicked in the shin playing soccer, there's really nothing on top of that bone. It's just basically skin and then periosteum and then your shin bone, and it's really painful. So that's periosteum for you. Sharpie's fibers are kind of interesting. They're also called perforating fibers, and these guys are these little tiny fibers that are going to be attaching the periosteum to the bone. So you can even see them here where they've pulled away kind of like a little piece of periosteum. You see these fibers that are there, and that's what's anchoring the periosteum to the bone, and that very painful when you disrupt them. And then the second type of membrane that's involved is the endosteum. And so endosteum is basically going to be lining more internal surfaces. So if you remember, for these long bones, we had this medullary cavity on the inside. Well, the endosteum is going to be lining that internal cavity, that medullary cavity. And then also, too, it's going to be located in the spaces between the trabeculae and the spongy bone. So like up here at the ends where we have, kind of more of a spongy bone arrangement, we're going to have endosteum that is located within those spaces as well. Okay, so just a reminder that the specific red bone marrow that we see in bones contains hematopoietic tissue, and this is where blood cells are made. So red blood cells, white blood cells, and the cells that become platelets. So red bone marrow is specifically located in spongy bone because it needs space for that process to happen. And just the fact that hematopoiesis does happen to occur more in flat bones, like the sternum is a pretty big hotbed for hematopoiesis, as well as irregular bones, like your coxal bones, your hip bones. So if they need to take a sample of your bone marrow, they'll typically do it from your pelvis. Your long bones are not really that active with blood cell formation.